So good morning, everyone, and welcome to those who are here in the Benedict the 16th main room and in the other connected room, and welcome to those who are in connection online from their own country, maybe with a different time zone, but all immersed in the kairos of these days of deep reflection and mutual enrichment. So multicultural communities for what kind of formation? This topic is characterized in these days, and today we'll have a synthesis and conclusion. But as yesterday Professor Pandolfi said, a conclusion which is not aimed at concluding, but to try to articulate what we said in these days about the spaces of formation and also in consecrated life, triggering processes. Pope Francis, about the ongoing pandemic in progress, said that worse than this crisis, there is only the risk of wasting it. So, mutatis mutandi, if in this Congress we were called into question and we were asked where are we at in our pathway of interculturality, the worst thing would be to waste this, not to take the chance of the experience of these days and of these years of work, as we heard yesterday. So without declining them in our academic and religious life in concrete projects, because as we were told yesterday, interculture is an inevitable process. So we have to trigger process to proceed from an interculture that becomes multicultural that becomes interculture. So we reflected on multiculturality and university formation, how to teach intercultural theology, how to teach theology in an intercultural way. Yesterday on multicultural and formation to consecrated life, with a presentation of the results of the research conducted in these years, and especially with the very necessary explicatio terminorum, multiculturality and interculturality. Very often these terms are confused. Multiculturality recalls terms as plurality, diversity, particularity, but without a being together, without an interrelation. So interculturality as a communication relation, enter into dialogue, communion, sharing and contamination. Today we'll wonder how we can answer to all the wishes and the urgency that came out from the interviews that we made in these years and from what we lived in these 3 days, so as to create immediately a bridge, a link between word and action. So we are glad this morning to welcome among us His Excellency Monsignor Angelo Vincenzo Zani, Secretary of the Congregation for Catholic Education. So just 1 year ago he was here. Then they were connected online because it was not possible to meet because of the restriction of the pandemic, in order to introduce in the study of Theology Global Compact on Education. So Archbishop Zani of the Diocese of Brescia completed his theological study at the University of St. Thomas Aquinas, at the Lateranensis University also, when he got a PhD in theology. Then he attended the Pontifical Gregorian University with a license in social science. Then he taught from 93 to 95 general sociology and sociology of religion. Since 92 is his Undersecretary of the Congregation for Catholic Education. In 2012, Secretary of this same congregation, and ordained Archbishop in January 2016 by Pope Benedict. To revive the commitment with and for the young generations, said the Pope in the message for the launch of the Educational Pact, to which His Excellency refers today, renewing the passion for a more open and inclusive education capable of patient listening, constructive dialogue, and much understanding. Today, Archbishop Zani, with his intervention, the Global Pact will emphasize how our challenges today are part of this Global Pact on which the whole Church and many universities and schools are involved. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words of introduction. And I would like to thank you all for the kind invitation that was extended to me. I would like to greet all the people who have joined us here in presence, but also remotely, on my own behalf and on behalf of the prefect of the Congregation for Catholic Education. Right from the very beginning, I would like to congratulate the organizers for this conference, the way it has been approached and organized, and how it was summarized in the introduction to these days we've been spending together. The approach to the theme of multiculturalism is very rich. It refers to the many different roots, basically, that multiculturalism has, and the Global Compact on Education that I would like to talk to you about fits into this context perfectly. And reality is a polyhedron with many facets, as Pope Francis always says, and multiculturality is the tool through which we can live in this multifaceted and pluralistic world. My contribution in this framework has the aim of illustrating what the Global Compact on Education is, that was launched by Pope Francis to rebuild the Global Compact. This was mentioned in the beginning. To rebuild means that there's something wrong that needs to be corrected. And secondly, I would like to, after having described to you the meaning of the Global Compact on Education, I would like to highlight the close connection between this proposal coming from the Holy Father and the intercultural dimension of formation, which today more than ever requires to be deepened at all levels. We need new models, new approaches, new paradigms for education. And we're not always well equipped to respond to these great challenges. Then why did the Pope launch this initiative, this Global Compact on Education? Very briefly, I would like to refer to the steps that have characterized this choice and the steps that were made. On September 12, 2019, Pope Francis issued an invitation to participate in the major event that was supposed to take place on May 14, 2020, inviting here in Rome the representatives from around the world to sign a covenant, an agreement at local and global level in order to rebuild the Global Compact on Education, but everything needed to be postponed because of the pandemic. And in the meantime, the pandemic itself has deeply changed our context, our lives, and our lifestyles and way of living. And after lockdown, there were economic and social repercussions. Educational systems entered into a phase of deep suffering, and academic systems likewise, not just schools, but universities. And in this context, this university, like all other universities, has been experiencing this situation and is still in this situation. And last year we had a gathering remotely where the halls that were all empty, with the invasiveness of the pandemic, well, this has triggered a widespread sense of uncertainty that has affected everyone, individuals and families, peoples and states, teachers, educators, all of us. All of us, as the Holy Father reminded us of so effectively last year at the end of March, we all found ourselves afraid and lost. Like the disciples of the gospel, we were taken unawares by an unexpected and fierce storm. And unfortunately, this storm is still in full swing. In his video message of October 15th, 2020, I forgot to mention, by the way, that after the message of September 2019, our dicastery had organized about 10 conferences in order to delve into and prepare the event that we were supposed to organize in May 2020. We organized 7 out of 10 meetings dedicated to the different aspects of the Global Compact on Education. What pertains, for example, the theme of democracy, peace, interreligious dialogue, intergenerational dialogue, the economy. So these were preparatory meetings that we organized. Everything had to be suspended, and the Pope relaunched the Global Compact on Education on October 15th, 2020, and he did so 2 weeks, about 10 days after having published Fratelli Tutti. So in the second message on the Global Compact on Education, we find a very powerful reference to both Laudato Si and Fratelli Tutti. And then, quite often, the Pope mentioned this topic repeatedly, speaking to the superiors generals of religious congregations that manage and run most of the thousands of Catholic schools we have all over the world, to entrust to them this task of introducing in the educational programs and curricula and syllabi of Catholic schools worldwide this new approach that is very close to the Holy Father's heart, namely educating by promoting dialogue between different stances and different cultures. And this speech that the Pope delivered to the Superiors General was followed by more than 700 superiors and directors of Catholic schools all over the world. And this has been extremely important because this has really boosted and launched our presence locally, where more than 30-40% of students are non-Christians and they're non-Catholic. Therefore, they're already experiencing in their classrooms the dimension of their different cultural and religious belonging. The Pope then repeated this message with during World Day of Peace, and then on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of COP25 on climate last year, he repeated the same message, and recently in the meetings that took place here. The most recent initiative took place on October 5th at the Vatican. The Pontiff met with representatives of religions on the topic religions and education. On the occasion of the World Day of Teachers and Educators that UNESCO has been promoting since 1994. Therefore, a representative from Unesco received a document signed by 20 representatives of major world religions, a very important document that we drafted and have been working on in the months prior to this meeting, involving the Muslim imams and Bartholomew, Justin Welby, the major representatives of both ecumenism and religions. And for the first time, representatives of religions started thinking together about the topic of education. Well, peace. Peace has been addressed many times, climate, but on education, for the very first time, we have come together and spoke about this, and representatives of major religions have asked to continue this dialogue because the topic of education is related to anthropology, it is related to vision, also the whole discourse on transcendence. And so it is there that multiculturality touches upon particularly sensitive issues. With all these speeches the Holy Father made in the last couple of years, and with his writings, well, this has set a very broad and tangible framework from which a line of thought and a strategy have emerged. And from here, projects and pathways can be devised at all educational, scientific, social, and ecclesial level. But I would like to now go back to the very root of the Global Compact on Education, because there is a main thread, basically, connecting several elements, which then led to the proposal of the Global Compact. And this main thread is deeply rooted. Basically, it has roots that go back in history. The element, I would say, that has generated the spark that led to the birth of the Global Compact is Pope Francis' own experience. He has always found himself with young people. He has a lot of experience with younger generations. He has worked for a long time in the educational domain. That's part of his personal history. This is a very important initial element that gives to the Global Compact on Education a very tangible dimension, which is typical of the way in which the Holy Father looks at things. Then the other reason, I would say, that has led to the introduction of the Global Compact is a very specific request that was addressed to the Holy Father by the Jews and the Muslims involved in education. And they asked the Holy Father to say something, to provide a compass, bearings, in order to educate younger generations in the current world and context. And here we see that the Pope, once he asked to draft these messages, and he actually worked on these messages himself, actually. So we see this main thread connecting Vatican II to the current times, the idea of education, the notion of education itself, that then was spelled out in all the documents that were issued since Vatican II, and which now has brought us to the simple message that the Pope has launched, but it's replete with proposals and thinking and also teachings. The starting point of this main thread is for sure a Council Declaration, Gravissimum Educationis, because it is there that, in the context of the Council, with the spirit that has characterized the Council, so it is there that the educational vision of the Church finds its location. During the Council, it was stated that education must respond to the needs of the human person that belongs to different cultures, come from different contexts. So the issue of diversity is already present in the embryonic idea that was developed about education on the part of the Church. But then from diversity, individuals must be helped to build fraternal or brotherly coexistence with other peoples. So the Council states to favor the true unity and peace on earth. So diversity is part of real life. And education is aimed at then digging deep and starting from the roots of each culture, but then the aim is to make each individual the protagonist of life in a community that's characterized by fraternity and peace, educating and becoming the protagonist of dialogue, of relationships, to build a new world and a new humankind. This is what the Council states. It is then from them that the different steps followed. which are the substrate, basically. They underpin the Global Compact on Education. We cannot forget Populorum Progressio by Paul VI, 1967. In the historical and cultural context of that time and age, we know they're very troubled times, Paul VI suggested to build and promote the development of peoples, underlining an important point. In order to achieve the development of peoples, we must educate all of man and all of mankind. So, integral education of the human person and all human beings. And in this case as well, we see emerging once again the topic of fraternity. And Paul VI, as a matter of fact, said that to educate all men in order to achieve a true development of peoples, we have to come to grips with three serious shortcomings or lacks. The first one, Paul VI said, it is the lack of thinking, of thought. We have to educate people to think, because thought allows you to go back into your own self. It lets you find the point of unity between your identity and everybody else, and it educates you to think. Let's think about Edgar Morin, who turned 100 just a few days ago, and he said we have to rethink our thinking. So this is the first important point. Secondly, Paul VI stated, we refer to an anthropology that is too poor. We have to instead be inspired by a rich and complete anthropology that does not forget the transcendent dimension. If we eliminate transcendence, then we step into relativism. It is not possible to educate within relativism. And the third major shortcoming that Paul VI alluded to is the lack of fraternity amongst individuals and amongst peoples. And here we see Fratelli Tutti, right? That really was inspired by Populorum Progressio. So educating all men and all man, we have to educate our thinking, having a vision of the human person, and we have to educate everyone in fraternity and dialogue. And this broad theme was recovered by John Paul II many times and on many occasions. But we cannot forget the memorable speech he delivered to Unesco on June 2nd, 1980. A historical speech where he connected education and culture, the convergence between Christianity and humanism, which stems from the relationship between Christianity and culture, educating in culture, into culture. And John Paul II on that occasion said, we have to educate and make culture in order to help men to be more rather than have more. A very important statement here. And then Benedict XVI, in his encyclical Caritas in Veritate, and on many other occasions, he took up these arguments that were introduced by his predecessors, and he developed them by drawing our attention on the educational emergency that we find ourselves in. And he replied that we have to react to this emergency with the culture of giving. In Caritas in Veritate, and I would like to quote number 34, he stated, today humanity appears to be much more interactive than it used to be in the past. This greater closeness must then be turned into a true communion. We're closer and closer, perhaps, but we are not brothers and sisters. So once again, the topic of fraternity that then Pope Francis once again takes up in the Global Compact on Education. Then Pope Francis then followed suit along the lines of the teachings of the Church that were developed since the Council. He summarized all the different issues that had been mentioned and addressed, and he urged everyone to sign a global compact on education. He invited everyone, scientists, thinkers, educators, sociologists, politicians, artists, athletes, you name it. We have to build the village of here on earth through education in order to be able to then give younger generations a sound and safe common home. And in the proposal of the Global Compact on Education, I believe that we can glimpse as a backdrop to this the extremely effective reflection made by the Pontiff in his address to the Roman Curia for the 2019 Christmas greetings. Soon after the launch of the Global Compact, the Pope on that occasion repeated once again to the epochal change that is a topic that is very close to his heart, and he said, "We are no longer in Christianity, not anymore. Today, we're no longer the only ones who produce culture. We're not the first, nor the ones who are the most listened to. So we therefore need a change in our pastoral mentality, which does not mean then moving on to relativistic pastoral care, but we have to find ways to once again represent the perennial truth of the gospel of Christ. And the cultural metamorphosis is an anthropological metamorphosis, as the Pope states in his messages. And this is the true reason for the many wounds that we have been suffering from. And education is the most appropriate and effective tool in order to bring about a true transformation at all levels, as it was highlighted in the recent G20 meeting that took place here in Rome, and then during COP26 conference, two major events that took place in Rome and Glasgow. In this context, I believe it is important to develop that interpretation key that becomes a pedagogical approach to education, universal fraternity, always thinking about cultural pluralism, always having this in mind. I see that we're running out of time, but I would refer very briefly, first of all, to what we read in Gaudium et Spes, where the world is being described as spatium vere fraternitatis, and with the recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti, the Pope effectively highlights this aspect, which then is basically implemented through the Global Compact on Education. Every day we have confronted by this issue that was prophetically indicated at number 54 of Gaudium et Spes, where you can read as follows. The living conditions of modern men from the social and cultural standpoint have deeply changed and are deeply changed, so that we can actually talk about a new age in history. But we are not able as yet to respond. To the one hand, we have fragmentation. On the other hand, we have a very powerful need for unity for humankind. And in this framework, I believe that we can underline, as a way also to implement the Global Compact on Education, a few reference points or steps that we can make. First of all, we are now in a new age in history. The Pope keeps repeating this. It is an unprecedented challenge that questions the identity and mission itself of the Church of Jesus Christ. Will the Church be able to sow the seeds of the kingdom of heaven at the heart of each of these major cultures? This challenge is a decisive turning point for the history of the Church. It's a kairos that we have, because this really questions us. It questions and involves the people of God, but each and every one of us as well. Regarding this specific scenario, John Paul II stated as follows at the beginning of the 1980s, and he said, to evangelize effectively, we need to decisively adopt a stance of exchange and understanding, to sympathize with the cultural identity of peoples and ethnic groups, and sectors of modern society. On the other hand, we need to work hard to bring about rapprochement between cultures so that the universal values of men can be accepted and welcomed everywhere in a spirit of fraternity and solidarity. Therefore, evangelizing at the same time means to penetrate deep into the specific cultural identities, but also favoring exchange between cultures, opening them up to the values of universality and also Catholicity. So the introduction of new pedagogical paradigms connected to the global compact on education to accompany younger generations in a creative and responsible way must happen with the involvement and support of two basic elements. One is of a cultural character, and the other one instead pertains to the church herself. The cultural element, well, the cultural landscape of our time and age, despite the fact that their nationalistic and corporate interests that still then exist, is characterized by the need to increasingly tear down discriminatory barriers. And an interesting clue seems to be, in the West at least, the collapse of ideologies amongst younger generations that favors a faster understanding of what the cultural identity of a project, of a social project, must mean. Not the exclusion of other identities or projects, but rather a richness within the dialogue with what is different to create a culture of inclusion, which is one of the main tenets of the global compact on education. Culture of inclusion, culture of dialogue. We need to speed up the transition from a conflict-based pattern, let's say, in the way in which we think about and manage our traditions and our cultural projects, to instead a method that's characterized by dialogue that implies and promotes cultural projects that are open and also that are permeable. And a very interesting report by the OECD comes to my mind at this point. And a few years back, this report stated the experts were asking themselves, of course, the basically approach is an economic approach, but it refers to a major global issue. So in the OECD, they were asking themselves, what features will the children need to have, the children who are going to or attending primary schools right now, who in 2030 and 2040 will graduate from college and from the university and will have to then enter the labor market. And from this analysis, they stated, we need qualified professionals now and in the future who are endowed with three main features. First of all, they will have to be innovative and creative. Number two, they will have to be able to reconcile, let's say, overcome the conflict-based approach, moving increasingly more towards the ability to solve problems, to mend rifts and fractures, so heal these fractures, these divisions. And thirdly, we need responsible, creative and innovative people who are able to solve problems and responsible. And in this sense, the Global Compact on Education for sure wants to stimulate this kind of development. Especially, this is a message that is being conveyed to educators of younger generations. This applies to the cultural landscape, but it applies ever more, and increasingly so, to the intra-ecclesial aspect, the challenge that was introduced by the situation of cultural pluralism in the contemporary world has impacted the understanding that the church has of her own self. We cannot forget that Paul VI in Ecclesiam Suam said the church is dialogue. The church has to become a dialogue. So becoming dialogue then is inspired by the Trinitarian form of the church. And indeed, this is an invitation, as for Balthasar used to say, to tear down the bulwarks, the conflicts. We have to go beyond all this. A church that shows herself to be a sacrament of universal dialogue, inspired by the model of the interiority of the supreme dialogue, that is the Trinitarian dialogue. And I would like to wrap up by providing you three indications that we can draw from the Global Compact on Education. It is important to bear in mind in the educational process. The Pope, in his first message, basically mentioned three goals. First of all, to put the human person at the center. The second goal is to develop all the potential of the human person, all his or her languages, his or her ability to establish relationships, the cultural aspects, the relational aspects, the aspect that's related to belonging in a way, through the language of sports, art, the arts, music, participation in social initiatives. And thirdly, we must be bold enough to educate, inform individuals who are able to put themselves at the service of the common good. So the person at the center, the person must be developed in all the dimensions of the human person through projects that have a medium to long term, let's say, horizon, and then we have to train and form people who can serve the common good. And in all this, I believe that the first guidance that we receive from the Holy Father is this attitude, interior and inner attitude that we have to acquire towards diversity. We have to be able to go out and reach out. As the letter to the Hebrews states, the church should not be afraid to go out towards him, out of the camp. We have to should not be afraid to step out of our camp, to look for the seeds of the word that are found in every cultures, in every group. The Global Compact on Education, once again, the Pope repeats to us, should open us up on a 360-degree radius. We have to engage in dialogue with everyone without being afraid, and without giving up our identity as well. A second instead indication refers to the action of the church. In doing all this, the Pope states, we must build the village of education. But we have to build the village of education. Well, this also means basically engage in a cleansing effort. We have to cleanse and purify our history and our culture. So education as a regenerating and purifying force, so that it can become a new yeast, a new leaven. And then thirdly, thinking about formation in the light of the Trinity, diversity, cultural diversity acquires a specific theological meaning and value, in addition to a pedagogical value that then must be applied in formation at all levels of Christian life. The Trinitarian God is the God who elicits differences, who pursues a work of dissemination rather than a project that's based on identity. Therefore, the difference of other religions and of the different cultures on an a priori basis is meaningful, it is significant for Christianity. And in conclusion, I would like to quote Cardinal Rossano, who used to say that the Christian economy will not be known and developed in all its virtues until it has been thought out, interpreted, and lived out in the religious categories of all peoples. At the same time, it can be considered that in contact with this, the religious traditions of peoples will have the opportunity to raise and express the best of what they carry within them. And I would like to say in conclusion that a true educational action is always a Trinitarian action, a Trinitarian act, meaning that whoever educates needs to die to give life to those who receive education. Those who receive education have to open up their hearts to then absorb what happens in the educational relationship. And there we find the tertium. So something else must be born, something new, both in the educator and in the student. Therefore, the the Global Compact on Education is the tool whereby education can become an element of hope and regeneration in the current context we live in. Thank you.
Grazie, Eccellenza.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your intervention, especially for reminding us how the issue of education is a pathway that has been concerning the Church for a long time. You quoted Paul VI, educating to thinking. We have to recall that to a more complete anthropology, we have our anthropology is too poor. Then Benedict XVI, the education emergency, and today Pope Francis to build the village of the earth, the global village. So an outgoing church also in these to go out in order to network, to enter into dialogue. We have to be in relation with others so to abate barriers, to heal the wounds, and train people responsible who can indicate new tracks. So thank you for this illuminating presentation, and I give the floor straight away to Professor Milena Santerini. She is an ordinary professor of General Pedagogy, lecturer in Social and Intercultural Pedagogy, director of the Research Center in Intercultural Relations at the Catholic University of the Sacred Heart of Milan, and the first level master in Intercultural Skills and Integration of Minors. She is currently National Coordinator for Fight Against Anti-Semitism at the Presidency of the Council of Ministers and Vice Presidents of the Shoah Memorial Foundation in Milan. She is part of several boards, editorial boards, and she works on the training of teachers. From 2013 to 2018, she was a member of the Italian Parliament, where she promoted the Joe Cox Commission Against Intolerance and Racism, and she's a delegate at the Council of Europe, where she chaired the No Hate Parliamentary Alliance. And she works on, and today Professor Santerini will talk about intercultural critical education between equality and differences. Thank you very much. I am very happy to reason with you in this intercultural milieu in a moment when we are not in Christianity any longer. I also quote what Bishop Zani said about Church and Dialogue by Paul VI. So I want to introduce to you a first point, which is the points of no return of this intercultural critical education. Very likely we'll say things that you already heard in the previous days, but I think it is important to fund the aspect, the epistemological premise, in order to talk about intercultural formation, the formation to intercultural competences, as an example of intercultural formation that I carried out recently with some missionary congregations. So, first point, the points of no return. What are the points of no return? For spreading and a perspective of real intercultural dialogue and exchange in a complex and tormented society like ours. And how can we increase and reinforce intercultural competences of those who are in charge of education, especially the younger generations? We share the responsibility to give a name and a scientific density to the phenomena concerning cultural pluralism and to direct reflection towards the ideal of a universal brotherhood. An idea of universal brotherhood, all brothers, that is difficult and dramatic but not impossible. So our point of reference is Pope Francis' encyclical All Brothers. The need for authentic intercultural relations arises from the reality in which we are immersed, a global, mixed, plural world in which today it is created by interconnection, hyperconnection, travel, but it always existed. The world has always been intercultural. But today, the profound tension towards unity, that we can find in all human beings, is countered by a thought of separation that tends to divide rather than connect. The tendency towards distinction has always been present in human groups and in the world of knowledge. Let us think of the difference between science and myth, or between history and memory. We need these categories. We have to differentiate in order to understand. But more and more, we need visions of the future in which, without false fusions and inadequate mergings, these diversities must meet and dialogue. I'm referring to Edgar Morin's idea of interconnected knowledge, or to the discoveries of neuroscience that we should all know better, when they base the study on human mind on what they call the Descartes' error, separating mind and body, which are so indissolubly linked. We have said how emotions are intelligent, and this distinction between rationality and instinct is totally fallacious. And another element, in the cultural world, the society is fragmented into so many islands and individuals in separate contexts. And then unifying instances, including the religious instances, seem weak. The identities of individuals appear less defined, ever-changing. Unlike the more protective, more defensive roles, but rigid roles. We can think of Charles Taylor. This authenticity of modernity, we conquered it with the freedom to go around, to choose our work, to get married, to do this or that, but we also paid for this. So lonely individuals that yearn for community, but eventually they build new rigid boundaries around themselves. So in the global work, where languages, artistic expression, trade, technology, and finance intertwine, the temptation to differentiate grows, making every identity a fortress and a danger. I quote only two examples of this temptation to distinguish. The first is so-called murderous identities of fundamentalist and sovereignist thinking. We see in these days great shame at the borders of Europe. We are pushing back Afghan children and Syrian children, or children from Yemen, people who are running out of dangers of war. They have a right to be accepted, and we are pushing them back. So the sovereign tentation that which makes racist peoples, ethnic groups re-emerge, that erects walls and borders and sacralizes frontiers and imposes the dictatorship of the nation on those who come from afar. And there is also another temptation that exalts minority cultures. We're not talking about the just exaltation of the dignity of cultures, but of the temptation of the cancel culture, the culture that abates all the controversial symbols, but very often creates new gaps between cultures. So we, and here I quote François Julien, who makes a distinction between a universality in principle, a principle prescribed, constitutive, pre-established universal, which we inherited from Greek philosophy, and the uniform, that which massifies and makes everyone seemingly equal in consumer society, like blind productivism in the market society. And Julian adds a third category of plurality, which is the common. So if indeed the etymology of the word comes from cum munus, that is the exchange and reciprocity, then communitas is a place where the relationship is founded, where a true sharing takes place. So the intercultural critical path can contribute to making possible a peaceful coexistence and non-ironic human coexistence, and to develop a profound understanding tested by differences. And I emphasize that tested. There is no intercultural project without attention to unity through differences. So differences must be tested. So we talk about an eschatological tension towards being together that recognizes difference without the temptation of fusion, but neither does it ignore diversity by ghettoizing it, by creating ghettos. So I'm sure that in our pontifical faculties, in the congregations, in the diocese, etc., we live this. So we need a common research for universal values on the basis of meaning, without despising differences, but neither turning them into myth. What is too familiar impoverishes, but extreme relativism creates incommunicability. So I wanted to recall these points of no return, to recall the second point, that is intercultural education. So what can be the basis and strategies of an intercultural formation that deconstructs the vision of culture that we described, a culture that is made an object territorially delimited, but we have to forget about this image of a territorial delimitation. A government can be over, or a normative system. Languages are different, but any culture is porous. It is permeable everywhere. We can say about a young Asian or young Europeans that listen to the same culture, that their culture is limited by the border of their country. So education, as Monsignor Zani said, with its very poor weapons, rejects the differentialist and culturalist temptation, but also it does not trust the overbearing universal. And it starts between it does not want the exaltation of culture. And we have this temptation in the ecclesiastical world, because we got to know colonialism, even the imposition of Western values. And today we have a claim of the other way around. Are we sure that this is the way? So an intercultural approach that is based on a dynamic vision of cultures where the personal features matter. In intercultural approaches, what is important is the fact also of being a man or a woman, not only the country you belong to, or young or old, or rich or poor. These are elements that have a deep influence on the cultural dimension, while we often see only that one. We see the fact that a person comes from another country as a distinctive element, and we consider that a fundamental element. But those who choose the path of intercultural education know that cultures are not pure, and they never were. Anthropologists say that there are scholars, many scholars from whom we can learn, and they tell us that culture has never been pure. They always mixed, they always created intersections. So searching for primordial elements is an incorrect operation. There are not pure elements that became then contaminated. Cultures do not exist outside the personal history. John Paul II said this very well when in a message, in a World Day for Peace, he said that they are a living culture. Only a living culture can be conveyed, while the dead cultures do not exist. And we often make reference to dead cultures, cultures that do not exist any longer. And then the theoretical, this critical conceptual framework that promotes a perspective of mutual transformation and not only of pure tolerance or relativism. And here this is the Christian way to interculture, let's call it like that. So this theoretical and conceptual framework should deeply change all the programs of education systems, formal educations, informal education, but very often this dynamic vision of culture and education is not taken into account. Why? There is a resistance that lies in the fact that the training action based on a static idea of culture makes programs easier. So I teach you that Japanese culture is done in this way, that it ends up at the borders of Japan, and with these doubtful pills, I taught you what is a high culture. So culturalist education tends to teach the other's culture, and inevitably simplifies, reinforces stereotypes and prejudices instead of combating them. I talk instead of an experiential type of training and education that is meeting the other, aiming to provoke a deeper change in the personality and worldview of the players, of the actors, and it's much more difficult. This type of education presents particular difficulties due to the resistance to question roles and taking a critical look at intercultural relations. Now, the last point, the intercultural competences. We need dynamic models, experiential models, something based on encounter and not on frontal experience. Of course, I contradict myself because I'm doing a frontal lesson now. But this happens because when we teach our students the interactive aspects, and then we realize that we are just giving a mono lesson instead of an inter lesson. So when we reflect on intercultural training, we preferably speak of competences, because when we talk of competences, we talk about a knowledge in action, a knowledge that plays with what we lived, what we already know. So for intercultural formation, we need to talk about competences. Otherwise, we talk about knowledge. So we need competence in order not to stiffen the social, cultural, and personal characteristics of the people I have in front of me who play, who are active players in our relationships. Many studies have focused on this concept, like the experts of the Councils of Europe started this study on intercultural competence, and think of by Byron Bennett, who talks about understanding respect differences, responding appropriately, establishing positive and constructive relationships, understanding multiple affiliations, so all the competences that are needed to interact with one another. And maybe the most well-known is Darla Derdorf, who will talk after me. I know her. Sorry, she talks about openness and respect on the one hand, and cultural awareness on the other, and also internal and external outcome. So adaptability, flexibility, empathy, decentralization, but also appropriate behavior. So we could add many elements that were singled out as elements of intercultural competence. So I just mentioned flexibility, the tolerance of ambiguity also, or empathy. So Darla Derdorf will talk about these, and these repertoires at least can be classified as compositional models. So like a list of what I should be in order to behave in a intercultural way, and developmental models that trace the temporal evolution of competence where elements influence each other. Because competences have an impact on each other. They have to be contextualized. They cannot be acquired once and for all. They can be lost, they can be not exercised. I was also impressed in the 90s by the reflection of the OCD on the fact that they made cultural programs in the Balkans that were very profound with the young people, and they found themselves with a devastating war. And we wonder, but our education to intercultural competences, how about this? So competences can get lost if there is a conflict. My capability for empathy, if I am a conflict with someone, just disappears, or my capacity of openness can be improved or be worsened in the encounter with others, because there are programs of getting closer, of sympathy with the Islamic world that show that empathy diminishes with some encounters in the mosque if they are not well managed. So it is not enough to say encounter with the other. So the systems elements are interdependent, the different elements are interdependent, especially intercultural competence cannot be based on an ethno-relativist vision that totally accepts the elements of a culture without exercising the necessary criticism, because very often this repertoire of intercultural competence have an ethno-relativist view, as if being intercultural would be a lack of judgment that accepts everything of the other person. Intercultural education instead is mutual transformation. It requires a reflection on the intercultural experience. So I would talk about the formation to intercultural awareness, on also with all the vague elements that we have in the term that we have to support, like this intercultural awareness of which we cannot trace at the borders, but it is something deep that concerns affectivity even before knowledge, and that we have to trace acting on the personality of operators and teachers. So I will close with an example of intercultural formation that we carried out You already gave examples, Luca Pandolfi with Enrico Ottone made examples. I also want to give an example about the intercultural formation that they normally carry out with teachers, educators, with social workers, but also with missionary congregations. So the objectives are what I said, to reconstruct an idea of culture, be immersed globally, to get used to new awareness, to defeat extreme relativism and build together what the common elements of common. So my experience was based on stories of real cases, true stories lived with suffering by people that we discussed in group, and we analyzed them. And through this work on case stories, incidents, and intercultural shocks, a new awareness came about based on three key axes. The first, understanding in depth the cultural expression of people in their intertwining with their being men or women, affluent or not, educated or not, young and old, etc. Then manage prejudices together and enrich the capacity to find common horizons, to identify common horizons. This formative reflection with some missionary families, people who proclaim the gospel and are on permanent mission, people with a centuries-long experience of inculturation, particularly from Europe to the Americas, to Africa, to Asia, etc. So I refer to a writing of Benedict XVI in the 19th, published on Asian News, about a meeting in Hong Kong when he explained that the gospel cannot be inserted in a culture as if it were a totally pure element, because the gospel was born within a culture, it was born within a language, within a story. So necessarily we have to talk of interculture, because the gospel is a culture that embodies into another culture, incarnates in another culture. So we talked about this experience of formation to people who are very expert in inculturation. But we also focused that the cultural issue changed its face. The cases we discuss reveal a turmoil that the whole church is living. I think of the transformation described by Philip Jenkins or Andrea Riccardi, the crisis of the church today. And we hope that they will lead to a new united world. So the transition from a European culture that has always supported paternalism, if not Western colonialism, in the past, at least after the Second Vatican Council, to pass to respect to other cultures has been fundamental, and is partly the merit of the missionaries of the Urbanian and many other scholar milieu. But once paternalism is over, it remains to build a new form of dialogue, avoiding the mechanisms that suggest a sort of alternation. Once our turn is over, it is our turn. So a paternalism that is a poorly understood relativism risks dividing not only Europeans and Westerners and others, but also creating gaps between people within the same country. We don't want to balkanize the church. The culture can become a belonging and affiliation that gives identity in a complex world. But even within a not huge community, one can divide oneself into groups, and nationality is the easiest affiliation, but can be also young versus old, women versus men, the more sober versus the more consumerist, etc. So, formation can help to understand that we no longer inculcate ourselves as a culture, since we have deconstructed it, and it has fragmented and almost dissolved in globalization. Interculturality in the missionary world is being close to multicultural people who live in the global world, conditioned by age or role or gender, more despite in addition to cultural belonging. So to have to remove the cultural implications within communities and not to fall into identity traps and distinguish between cultural dynamics and power dynamics. The distinction between social conventions and moral sense are crucial. The former are transitory and linked to the context, but the latter, the moral sense, finds its foundation in the law written within us. Social conventions can be relativized, but respect for the others cannot. So this compass remains the question of meaning in the light of the Gospels. They are placed in the cultural and linguistic universe of the time in which they were written, but they do not compare on a par with today's cultures. The Gospel remains a metacultural yardstick that converts to the overcoming of all identity, constraints, and call for a greater belonging and universal brotherhood. As we read in Fratelli Tutti, it obliges us to understand others and ourselves in depth, refining our sensitivity and building together what we call the common. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you so much, Professor Santorini. Thank you also for this reference you made. So we started from Fratelli Tutti, and then we went back to Fratelli Tutti. So we started from this need to move towards an ideal of universal fraternity against what you defined as the thought of separation. And yesterday we were actually referring to what you have delved into today. So cultures are not pure. They've never been pure. Yesterday we were talking about contamination, osmosis. The culture that does not end where a border is found, which is instead porous, is then patent. And this allows us to question our own selves in front of our own selves and in front of the world. So the core of your message is we should have an experience-based cultural formation that can provoke change in the vision of the world of the others with a critical outlook on things, for sure. So therefore, competencies, we have to, of course, challenge ourselves so that this dialogue and this relationship does not become rigid. And this, I believe, is the perfect follow-up to Monsignor Zani's presentation, but this also connects us to the following presentation, which is a video message from Professor Darla Deerdorf. She's a researcher at Duke University, expert in cross-cultural education for 20 years. She's executive director of the Association of International Education Administrators, as well as a research scholar at Duke University. She's also a trainer for the European Association for International Education. She has lived and taught abroad in Germany, Switzerland, and Japan. She has a PhD in education for almost 20 years. She has run intercultural training courses for universities, nonprofit organizations, and for-profit companies. And she has published extensively with respect to her field of research. And the title of her presentation is Guidelines and Points of No Return for International and Intercultural Training or Formation. And I would like to start the video because it's a video message.
Darla Deerdorf. She is based in the USA, North Carolina, and is a research fellow at Duke University. She has faculty appointments at several other universities around the world. She is the founding president of the World Council of Intercultural and Global Competence, executive director of the Association of International Education Administrators. She also works with international organizations like the United Nations and OCSE. Learning intercultural competence is the core issue in the internationalization of higher education. What are the priority challenges for teacher training at higher education levels?
Sure, the challenges, or some of the challenges at least, for teacher education in higher education, particularly around intercultural competence development, include several of the following, and I just want to outline several of those. First, it's really important in regards to integrating intercultural competence into the curriculum for teacher education training, that this goes beyond knowledge. It's not enough to just have intercultural knowledge, but when we think about intercultural competence, it's also the skills. What skills do teachers need interculturally to connect with students from so many different backgrounds? And so it's important that teacher training really address intentionally not just the intercultural knowledge needed by teachers, but also the intercultural skills and competencies needed by teachers. And as I've worked with teacher education programs, I'm seeing that that's an area that really needs often a lot more attention. So that's number one. Number two, and I already alluded to this, is how to integrate the intercultural competence I mentioned into all of the teacher education curriculum, that it needs to not just be one course or one module where we say, okay, now we're talking about intercultural competence, but we need to look at how this competence gets integrated throughout the curriculum. And what that means, or what that looks like, is how to include different perspectives, different resources from around the world, how to carefully examine the curriculum insofar as looking at whose knowledge is being privileged in the curriculum, whose voices are included, and especially whose voices are missing in the curriculum. That it really comes then to more of a social justice focus, even within intercultural competencies, so that the curriculum is very carefully reviewed to see then in the end, even what's the hidden curriculum, what messages are we sending by what and how the knowledge is being taught. So there's a lot to this piece of it around how do we integrate intentionally these intercultural dimensions into all of the curriculum for teacher education. So that's a really huge challenge, and one that it's really important to address. And then as well as going beyond the knowledge to the skills, which then brings us to a third challenge in teacher education in regard to intercultural competence development in particular, and that is the assessment. And how do we assess teachers' intercultural competence? And this is the area of my research and work for quite a number of years now, is looking at the assessment aspects, which again need to be integrated into the curriculum, not as a pre and post, and not focus so much on the results about whether teachers are more interculturally competent or not, but it's more about how they can continue to grow and develop interculturally, because intercultural competence is a lifelong process, so that in the end the assessment even becomes much more about the process, assessing the process of development than the results. And in terms of assessment, what we're seeing is that it's important to move beyond any kind of pre and post measures to really looking at the evidence that we can collect within the educational experience and learning, providing that key feedback to teachers as they continue to develop interculturally. And in the end, we're seeing a trend toward perhaps more peer assessment and the use of peer assessment and feedback of ways of of really looking at how we can support the development. So it's not just that either you have it or you don't, but how can we continue to support the students' development interculturally, and that's often through a multi-measure, multi-perspective kind of approach, even with the support pieces. The last challenge I would bring to this discussion would be that we need to do much more in terms of preparing and supporting the instructors in teacher education. That what we're seeing is that too often the academics, the instructors who are teaching, often don't understand this fully themselves. They need to be able to be better prepared and then supported as they then go into the classroom to work with the students. And so that's another huge challenge that really must be addressed. And so those, I guess, would be the key challenges I would put forward in this discussion.
Learning intercultural competence is a lifelong process. What does this mean for university education?
Intercultural competence in university education really comes back to seeing intercultural competence as really a core to internationalization efforts. And typically, internationalization efforts are seen more primarily as mobility, of moving students around the world. And of course, during a pandemic, as we've all been experiencing, that has not been as possible. And so through my work with internationalization leaders at universities around the world, we're really preferring to see this more as comprehensive internationalization at the university level. So it's so much more than mobility. It's also looking at partnerships at different levels, not just mobility partnerships, but in terms of research and collaboration with universities within one's own country and beyond, especially. But moreover, what we're seeing, and this comes back to the comment I made earlier, the curriculum really is at the heart of internationalization. And it becomes imperative that intercultural competence be embedded and integrated intentionally throughout the entire curriculum at the university level. And I'll give you one example of how this was done, at least at a public university in the United States, and where the top leadership, the rector level, went to the academics and said, please give me outcomes that are intercultural outcomes for the students. And so the faculty, the academics at this university spent several months developing this list of outcomes, and they came back with 50 intercultural outcomes for students. And the top leadership said, thank you. Now I need you, the academics, to prioritize what are the top 5, because 50 is too many. So what are the top 5? And so again, they went to work many months debating, discussing what are the top 5. And these are academics from all different areas of the university, from chemistry to music to physical education to language. So really pan-university academics. In the end, they agreed on the top 5 intercultural outcomes, and they came back to the top leadership and said, here you are. And then the top leadership at the university said, thank you. Now, every single academic at this institution needs to include at least 2 of these 5 intercultural outcomes in every single course that is taught here, regardless of the subject, topic, or so on. So that is one way to more intentionally integrate these intercultural outcomes into all that is taught at a university. And so that's what we're kind of aiming for, is how do we integrate this throughout a university so that it's not just a one-time experience over here for a student to do an exchange program. It's not just one course that's required. Okay, now you've had that, now you can go on with everything else. But it's it's about integrating these intercultural, global, and international dimensions into every facet of the university, including not just in the classroom, but also out of the classroom. So looking at co-curricular opportunities and how do we incorporate and embed and integrate these intercultural and global dimensions into what happens outside the classroom as well. So that in the end then becomes comprehensive internationalization, and it becomes part of the fabric of the university. That's what we're aiming for, at least.
The future of education is international. What is your dream about present and future education?
So related to, particularly with intercultural dimensions within education, I have so many dreams and ideas about the future. But we would really look at this more as I think increasingly as a lifelong process, that we recognize that particularly in higher education, we only have students with us for a short time. And so in terms of looking at education much more comprehensively into the future as a lifelong process, certainly intercultural competence development is a lifelong process for all of us. We only work with students a short amount of time. And so it's important to look at this in the long term. I've actually been involved in working both with the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as UNESCO with the United Nations, in terms of looking at the futures of education. And with OECD, it's Education 2030. And some of what we've been discussing there is looking at how to really put students at the center of what we do, and empowering students, and seeing education as something we do in partnership with our students. It's not something we kind of give to them, do to them, but we're working together to co-create the education, the knowledge, the skills needed for their future. That we're looking at this again in terms of a lifelong process. It's not just something that's done just in this short amount of time. That it's something that's much more inclusive and comprehensive in terms of access for all, that we're much more aware of the messaging that is done through the curriculum, and trying to be more inclusive there as well. And then it's something that doesn't just stay in classrooms, but that it's something that we take out into the communities and engage in the real world, and with our local communities in very meaningful ways. And we're seeing some of this happening already through, for example, service learning opportunities, where volunteer service is built into courses, where students do go out into the community to engage. And of course, that's been happening for a long time now, but really looking at how can we embrace more of this type of approach to education, so that we don't just stay within the four walls of a classroom. So there's so much in terms of looking to the future of education, to looking at the future of intercultural competence development, that again, it doesn't just even remain within the higher education sector, but looking at how can we take this out for all in many different sectors, whether that's within social work, or it's incredibly relevant within healthcare. And there's a lot of good work being done in the healthcare sector around intercultural competence, even with law enforcement. I mean, looking really comprehensively across all sectors. Basically, anyone who works with humans needs intercultural competence. And so how do we address this for all and within our local communities to help bridge divides that some would say not only have we been faced with the pandemic of COVID, but in many ways, at least in my country, we've been faced with a pandemic of hate and division. And so how can we look to address this, to bring others together so that we can really understand the oneness of our shared humanity. And one other example I would give is some of the work I've been doing with UNESCO in trying to address this. through something called UNESCO Story Circles. And this is where we've been using story circles around the world to not only help persons develop and practice key intercultural competencies such as listening for understanding, which we too seldom do as humans. We tend to listen for response or for judgment. It's just normal. But to really help persons understand more what it's like to listen for understanding to each other. And through these story circles, they've really become quite transformational in helping persons, again, embrace that shared humanity and not as a way of moving beyond our differences. And I would invite those who are engaged in this session now to look into this methodology, this intercultural methodology. It's available through an open access manual in 5 languages. I'm not sure it's in Italian yet, but it's in Spanish and French and Arabic and Russian and so on. And we would certainly I'd love to connect with anyone who's interested in engaging more with that particular methodology. But taking that out further, really, again, kind of the dream is reaching as many people as possible beyond the walls of a classroom. And really seeing education and intercultural competence development as this lifelong process. It's a journey that we're all on, that we hopefully go every day towards something which we don't know. We continue to approach every day as an opportunity to learn more, and that we engage with others who are different from us, that we move outside our comfort zones, that we look for every opportunity to try to bridge those divides, as we all work together to address the pressing challenges confronting all of us as humans on this earth.
And now, before we conclude, Darla Deardorff would like to leave her own message to you.
So I wanted to thank you so much for this opportunity to be with you in this way. I'm so sorry I cannot be there in person. I would welcome any of you to contact me directly through LinkedIn, and also wanted to share a special invitation to all of you who are interested in intercultural competence to please join the World Council on Intercultural and Global Competence. It's at www.iccglobal.org. We are having a global meetup on November 16, and you are all welcome to join. We also have numerous working groups. Most of them are in English. One is in Spanish. So you are welcome to join and be part of this community around the world of both researchers and practitioners who are connecting with each other to learn from each other and to really advance our understanding and praxis around intercultural and global competence development. So hope to see some of you there at the World Council, and again, would welcome connecting with you through LinkedIn. And thank you again so much for this opportunity to be with you in this way. Grazie.
Bene, abbiamo accolto volentieri.
So we welcome this intervention of Darla Deardorff that opened as a perspective of what it means international and intercultural formation. She said it is a process, lifelong process, that it is not cannot be just a course to be added to the university curriculum. It is a process that the university must run in rethinking its own formative and teaching function. So it is not a course, but a process, lifelong process, in order to acquire habitus, and that concerns all the other sectors of life. So now we have 20 minutes to open a debate. So if you have questions or if you want to add something or clarify something to our speakers today, and also on the side of those who are connected from home, you can write a question on the chat box and we will read it up and please specify to whom you address your question. And also here in the room, you can ask a question on the microphone. You can raise your hand and you will be given a microphone to ask your question. It was a video recorded interview. Who would like to break the ice? Professor Pandolfi. I would like to emphasize the concept of the many. Listen to the formation of formators. It came back several times. Also from what Monsignor Zani said, that the attention to education should concern educators in a way. And Professor Santarini talked about intercultural competences on which we should focus not only our formative experience, but also the experience of formators on themselves, and there are a lot of added practical indications such as organize things in such a way that this element will become an opportunity for verification. Yesterday also we spoke about these to establish concrete pathway moments of verification where the teachers, the formators ask a question, where is my attention now? I like very much what Darla Derdo said about the fact that this should not be the evaluation of a judgment or putting someone under investigation, but just to see the process, where we are at with the process, with the idea of peer-to-peer formation. I like this very much. That is the idea that we can question ourselves structurally and regularly. Temptation is to say, oh, we have other business, other priority, but our philosophy is contextual, so we don't have a pure theology, pure philosophy, we don't have pure law or human science, but everything has a history. So my question that I open up, do you think it is appropriate also in view of what we call the quality verification? Every 5 years we should do that. So before this verification of quality should be, what would you advise so that on a stable basis we can do a peer-to-peer mutual formation about where I am with my subject, with my discipline, where is the attention to plurality of wisdom and knowledge, different kinds of approach, and also consider that in university curricula we should have specific courses for this. But what do you think of what was said about formation of formators? First of all, thank you for this morning, which is very rich with different approaches that integrate each other and complete each other. Now about the consideration made by Professor Pandolfi, was thinking of the work we carried out as a congregation in view of the 50 years of Gravissima Educationis, the world meeting we had in 2015, and then after having welcomed and experiences from all over the world on a school and university level, what came out were the four basic pillars of education. That is, the identity of the project, identity that should be compared with differences and different belongings, because the identity of projects should be there. So it's not a closed box, but it is a vision and anthropology. The second principle that came out we talked about the educational community, so not only the teachers, but it is a context, it is a milieu, it is the setting of the different subjects that have a concurrence in this. We talk about the family, the social context, the school, the ecclesial context. On a university level, we talk about the third mission. So a university that is not only focused on teaching and learning and research, but also on the way we look at the world and society. The third pillar is what you emphasized. The third pillar, the strongest one maybe, is the formation of formators, because we can have extraordinary projects, we can have a strong community, but eventually, if we don't have a well-trained educator, it is useless. So the choice, the selection of the teachers, their lifelong training, the evaluation, the dynamics the educators must bring ahead in the institution. So this thing of formation of formators is a crucial point everywhere. And then the last point is looking at challenges. So to be open, to be questioned by the challenges that change from situation to situation, from context to context, and must be able to read them within the context. I was thinking of an experience that we have been living in the last 3 years in Africa. I went to Rwanda for the 4th time, where the bishops, on the anniversary of the genocide, they said we wanted to start afresh from education, because through education we want to rebuild the social fabric and cultural fabric of our country. So we had a first meeting, about the tragedy of the genocide of 1994, with 2 million victims. So the ground is not totally healed, and we feel the need to reconstruct this connective fabric of the life of this country. So the Church says we want to give our contribution through education, because only the education of young generations will enable to a country where two ethnic groups massacred each other, to look at the face of others and welcome others. So we are not in abstract pluralism, but we are in a very concrete situation. And there was where the idea to carry out this work came, not only in Rwanda, but also we got connected with Burundi, then the Democratic Republic of Congo, and now with Cameroon. And the 4 Catholic universities made an agreement to build a study center to develop an African pedagogy. We know where the vision came, European, Belgian, French, etc. So the French-speaking regions of Africa are making this choice, and there is Africans can rediscover themselves through a dialogue, and here selection of university and school teachers is crucial, also for starting from primary schools or even kindergarten, maternal school. And I was thinking of another passage when Pope Francis, in answering to educators, it was a very numerous groups of Jesuits, he said, answering to their questions, that educating is a dynamic process. We have to walk step after step, and we must put one foot on the border of security, of vision. We must have one foot in the ideas, in the proposals and visions, but the other foot we have to put it in the challenges. We have to throw ourselves into the great challenges today. And when we find a point of connection, you put your foot there and you leave out the other side and you make another step forward. You cannot remain in the educator only being closed in your zone of comfort because there is no education, there is no growth there. And not even you can only remain with the great challenges without points of reference. So you must find this balance between certitudes and challenges, provocations and concrete proposals. That's the task of educators, and also being updated all the time. Unesco, as Professor Santorini referred to, is approving in these days a document, one of the big reports entitled The Futures of Education. So the future perspectives of education. So after the other important documents, we perceive that education is the basic tool to invest the best energy on the young generations, and we must go beyond this crisis. The Pope spoke about a big crisis provoked by pandemic, so we must be able to go beyond. So education helps us to go beyond, to overcome the limits. Limits comes from limen, which means something that ends there, but at the same time it is a threshold that opens. So education is going towards the threshold that opens our eyes on what is beyond. The limit is not something that should limit us, but it should be a drive towards beyond. Education is this, and if it is not this, if it is not only repetition or learning something, it does not generate new persons. Thank you. So the question of Luca Pandolfi, whether to insert an element of verification in the formation of formators, not to evaluate, but to support this process of welcoming in acceptance of plurality. I see this well in this perspective. So if it is not an element that stiffens, that makes education more rigid, I suggest you should be carried out at more than one level. The first level is how much did we introduce plurality, the awareness of cultural and religious pluralism into my discipline, into knowledge in general, on an epistemological level. Second, how much did I leave it in the relationship with students? And the third, how much did I leave in the relationship with the academic community, so with my colleagues? And maybe the fourth mission that Monsignor Zani mentioned, I suggest to differentiate these levels and maybe to consider them all, because if you wanted to really open and make a verification of how much formators who give information to others are themselves open to plurality, to cultural pluralism, then we have to do this on a human, professional, epistemological level. So this is my advice. Up there,
Monsignor Zani for the presentation, and I will direct my question to him. Thank you so much for the exposition with regards to the efforts of the Catholic education in establishing a pedagogy that will be very inclusive. I think that goes with you quoted, I forgot someone you quoted a document where you say that Christianity will be better lived when it is lived in the religious categories of the people. And I think there is this urgent need to allow even the pedagogy of studies to also speak to the academic categories of those that are meant, which we have already started, especially with regards to the Francophone African situation. I don't know whether the congregation also takes into cognizance the fact that sometimes those who gather also to bring out the yardsticks or the parts for those things that will form that will inform the pedagogy that is needed, are also, to a great extent, imbued with a specific area, what I may like to refer to, for lack of a better explanation, Western categories. Because in some situations, especially with regards to the affiliate institutions, we find a situation whereby some of the things required for studies do not actually speak to the existential sensibilities of the students learning those things. There is a kind of objective or universal, for instance, metaphysics. But then there could also be an Igbo or African metaphysics, an Igbo metaphysics that speaks more to the categories of an Igbo man. I am an Igbo man from Nigeria. There is a metaphysics that speaks to them, but these are not actually included in the pedagogy of studies. And when that is done, the person being formed in the academia comes out with a westernized category and becomes a stranger in the same environment he's supposed to evangelize. I would like to know what actually your congregation is doing to take care of these issues with regards to, because sometimes the harmonization of the curriculum of study that come from Rome, very so often they lack in this regard. Thank you.
Prego, Eccellenza, se vuol rispondere.
Sì.
Yes, I will answer quickly because of the time, but also because it is a very important question and very heavy in the sense of the content, very dense. So what are we doing? I think the recent Apostolic Constitution, Veritatis Gaudium of 2017, with the Proemius, the foreword, which is the reading key of the dispositions, because we need the norms, applicative norms. But the overall vision that we find in the Proemius of Veritatis Gaudium goes in this direction. And it is obvious that Constitution does not mean that everything is done. We give indications there, and we need years to implement and elaborate the strategies, applicative strategies, when there are teachers who educate in a certain way, they were trained in a certain way, and so it is a big change that will require time. But the approach goes in this direction, and it takes into account The big differences, it was 2 years ago, I went to Thailand to introduce Veritatis Gaudium to all the Asian countries, and even more, we perceive this question that you introduced as an appeal that comes from Africa. And the same thing, I gave the example of Rwanda, but these four universities, French-speaking African countries, are working with African scholars who studied in Europe, but together they're trying to recover the African culture. So, as Professor Santarini said, we have to be able to dialogue, and what should emerge is the positive aspects of all the cultures and going beyond purifying the memory, purifying history. In Brazil, for example, I went 2 years ago, and they said, you have to tell us how we can do education to history in our schools, because everything is ideological. So there is this whole ideological approach. Everything is culturally connotated by the history of colonialization. On the other hand, there is a philosophical vision that is totally different. And the last example, during a Zoom presentation of the Global Compact on Education in Thailand, where every month there are 5,000 school managers and teachers who want to have a dialogue with us, and underlined one of the points of the Global Compact that says focusing on the person, put the person at the center. And they say, don't highlight these because here it has a totally negative repercussion. And they got scared. What is it? They said, yes, because here we have the king, who is a semi-god, and saying putting the person at the center means to encourage students who have been protesting constantly against the system of their country. So be careful. Some messages have also to be mediated, and this is the one topic of interculture. Another example, to say how scenarios open in all directions. In Cuba, you cannot open a Catholic school, because the bishop come and they say, we began to work to introduce a different anthropology in a context, and we know very well what it is. The teachers of school teachers only know one vision of the person, which is characterized by the history of Cuba, and we know what it is. So we began to propose during the summer to do 2 or 3 days of updating for the teachers who wanted to come. So course of philosophy and of philosophical anthropology. And we began 1 year with 300 years, and now we have 4,000, and we have to multiply the meetings during the summer, because there is a great curiosity by those who received a very ideologically approached formation to get out of this scheme and have no different visions. So when the Pope says we are in an epochal change of epoch, he touches all these problems, and within these problems we have to go to the essence of the proclamation of the evangelical proclamation of the gospel that gives us the vision of man and the human person according to Christian revelation, and make again this effort of inculturation, getting out of local culture everything that had a negative effect, and then we are all at the same level. We have to begin again with the richness of history, but also taking out all the mistakes we made and being able to educate, to read and correct the mistakes, because we must help young people to do this. So we educators are the first who must have a precise vision, this can be translated into the context that you said, that is typical, that concerns our institutions, the affiliated institutes, and that is a specific topic. Everywhere must use the same scheme, the same approach, which is maybe Eurocentric. It is a bit conditioned by our vision of anthropology, and somebody says that don't bring us your European culture that created so many disasters. And they're right, but today we have to mix the cards and meet a way out that can be shared. So we have 108 affiliated universities affiliated to our university. So thank you, Archbishop Zani, thank you, Professor Santarini, for their contribution and for their answers they gave. Before the coffee break until 11:30, as I see, in continuation with this Congress and with what Professor Santarini said, that the culture does not finish with the border, and the migration issue is recalled. So we have a study day on November the 30th, organized by the Faculty of Theology, and specifically in pastoral theology and human mobility, for migration between theological thought and pastoral action. So this as a continuation with these cultures and this tension to interdisciplinarity. So we have a break until coffee break until 11:30. Thank you.